and I lay my life before you. How I love you, Jesus, I adore you, and I lay my life before you. How I love you, Spirit, I adore you, and I lay my life before you. Oh, how I love you.
For this reason, I bow my knees before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth derives its name. Good morning. It is good to see everyone here with us this morning. We are glad that you are able to be with us. If you're watching online, we're glad that you're with us as well. As we come together on this day, I know Tim is going to talk just a little bit about the specialness of this day from a secular standpoint, but as we come together today on Father's Day, we also come together on a Sunday, as we do every week, to celebrate and to worship the Father in heaven. And so we're glad that you are with us this morning. We want to continue to encourage you guys, as we're glad that we're able to be a little bit back to normal in some ways. We know we don't have everyone back with us just yet, and we want to encourage you all to continue to think about the safe social distancing and wearing a mask if at all possible, just to help those around us, as we know that some of the numbers have still continued to increase in our area. And so just be careful. We want everybody to get through this safe and sound. But we're glad that you're with us this morning. We're glad to be able to worship the Father this morning. And as we do so, we're going to be singing some songs and reading some scripture that remind us of our Father in heaven, and hopefully hear a lesson that will encourage you and not only uplift Him and glorify Him, but encourage you to do better in your daily walk with Him as we go through this life together. Thank you for being with us.
First off, I'd like to wish all the fathers a happy Father's Day. You know, being a father is an honor and a privilege, but it comes with great responsibilities. I'd like to read a little poem actually Belinda gave to me that indicates, especially the fathers, the impact we can have and the importance of being a father. Walk a little slower, Daddy, said a little child so small. I'm following in your footsteps, and I don't want to fall. Sometimes your steps are fast, sometimes they're hard to see. So walk a little slower, Daddy, for you are leading me. Someday when I'm all grown up, you're what I want to be. Then I will have a little child who will want to follow me. And I would want to lead just right and know that I was true. So walk a little slower, Daddy, for I must follow you. Let's bow together. Lord, we understand that fatherhood does not come with a manual, and reality teaches us that some fathers excel while others fail. We ask for your blessing for them all and forgiveness when it is needed. This Father's Day, we remember the many sacrifices fathers make for their children and family, and the ways both big and small they lift children up to achieve their dreams. We also remember those who have helped fill the void when fathers pass away early or are absent. Grandfathers and uncles, brothers and cousins, teachers, ministers, and the women of the family. For those who are fathers, we ask for wisdom and humility in the face of the task of parenting. Give them the strength to do well by their children and by you. And Lord, we're thankful for the blessings of this day and for the opportunity to come together as a family to worship you. And we pray that our efforts to do so are acceptable. Lord, during these difficult times as we work to find ways to worship you and study your word, and at the same time trying to keep everyone safe, bless us with the wisdom and the knowledge to do so in a manner that is pleasing and acceptable to you. Lord, we pray and ask for special blessings for all of those of our family that are having health problems or are in need of prayers. We pray for the ones that are sick, that are shut in the hospital, or having medical tests or surgeries coming up. And we especially want to ask for your blessing for those affected by the COVID virus across our nation and the world. We pray that they would we pray for them and their caretakers, and we pray, Lord, that they would have everything that they need. Lord, we want to make special mention at this time of Tyrus' mother, Shirley Butler, who in addition to other medical problems is now tested positive for the COVID virus. Lord, please bless her with peace and comfort. Lord, guide us through our worship service this morning and the remainder of this day. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Father, we love you, we worship and adore you, glorify your name in all the earth. Glorify your name. Glorify your name. Glorify your name in all the earth. Jesus, we love you. We worship and adore you. Glorify your name in all the earth. Glorify your name. Glorify your name. Glorify your name in all the earth. Alas, and did my Savior bleed, and did my sovereign die? Would he devote that sacred head for such a worm as I? At the cross where I first saw light, and the burden of my wrong rolled away. It was there by faith I can see my sight, and now I am happy all the day.
I would sing the rest, but I don't know it. Get up your Bibles to Matthew chapter 27 as we prepare to take the Lord's Supper. Rather lengthy reading of Matthew 27. When I read Matthew 27, you will recall Isaiah 53. And there's one particular verse I'll point out that when I read it, I think about Acts chapter 2. Because of what the people said that day when Jesus was going to be crucified. And then in Acts chapter 2, when Peter helped him realize it was you who put him on the cross. And so it impacts us because we realize our sins on the cross. Matthew chapter 27. We see that Jesus has been bound and brought to Pilate. In verse 11, and Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, saying, Art thou the king of the Jews? And Jesus said unto him, Thou sayest. And when he was accused of the chief priests and elders, he answered nothing. Then said Pilate unto him, Hearest thou not how many things they witness against thee? And he answered him to never a word, insomuch that the governor marveled greatly. Now at the feast of the governor was wont to release unto the people a prisoner, whom they would. And they had been a notable prisoner called Barabbas. And notice there, notable prisoner. Remember the words he had said, Do you not realize what they have said against you? He was without sin. And he didn't utter a word. Verse 17, Therefore when they were gathered together, Pilate said unto them, Whom will ye that I release unto you? Barabbas or Jesus, which is called Christ? For he knew that for envy they had delivered him. When he was set down on the judgment seat, his wife said unto him, saying, Have thou nothing to do with that just man? For I have suffered many things this day in a dream because of him. But the chief priests and elders persuaded the multitude that they should ask Barabbas and destroy Jesus. Isn't it amazing that even through this they thought they were destroying him? The governor answered and said unto them, Whether of the twain will ye that I release unto you? They said, Barabbas. Pilate said unto him, What shall I do with Jesus, which is called Christ? Now God said, Let him be crucified. And the governor said, Why? What evil hath he done? But they cried out the more, saying, Let him be crucified. When Pilate saw that he could prevail nothing, but that rather a tumult was made, he took water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, I am innocent of the blood of this just person. See ye to it. Then answered all the people and said, His blood be on us and on our children. Now remember that in just a moment when you read Acts 2. Then released he Barabbas unto them, and when he had scourged Jesus, had Jesus scourged, he delivered him to be crucified. Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the common hall and gathered unto him the whole band of soldiers. And they stripped him and put him on the scarlet robe. And when he had platted a crown of thorns, they put it upon his head and a reed in his right hand, and they bowed the knee before him and mocked him, saying, Hail, King of the Jews! And they spit upon him and took the reed, and they smote him on the head. Isaiah prophesied this would happen. What God says happens. What he foretells through inspired men happens. And after they mocked him, they took off his robe and said, Put on his own raiment on him, and led him away to crucify him. And as they came out, they found the man of Cyrene, Simon by name. Him they compelled him to bear his cross. And when they were coming to a place called Golgotha, that is to say, a place of the skull, they gave him vinegar to drink, mingled with gall, and when he had tasted thereof, he would not drink. John talks about what great love the Father has bestowed upon us. We have to call to mind when we take the Lord's Supper every Lord's Day what our Savior went through, else this will become meaningless to us. So let us put this in our heart. In Acts chapter 2, when Peter was preaching to them, in verse 22, Acts 2, You men of Israel, hear these words, Jesus of Nazareth, a man approved of God among you by miracles and wonders and signs, which God did by him in the midst of you, as ye yourselves also know, him being delivered by the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God. Remember, they thought they were doing this to Jesus, but God was delivering them through this terrible thing. You have taken by wicked hands, have crucified and slain. We know that day that there were many that were convicted. We are thankful for the sacrifice of Christ. So as we partake the Lord's Supper this day, let us remember these things in our heart and partake of these things in the well-pleasing manner. Let's pray before the prayer. Father, thank you for loving us. We thank you for Jesus, who was willing to die for us, to endure all those things. We're grateful that we can see the entirety of Scripture that you've given us, that we can understand you had this plan from the very beginning. We pray that you bless this bread, which represents his body, as we can take of it, help us to recall the pain that he went through just for us. In Christ we pray. Amen. Let's pray here. Father, we pray that you bless this fruit of vine, which represents the blood that was shed on the cross by our Savior, your Son. Thank you for loving us. We thank you that he was willing to be a friend to us and give his all. As we've taken this, help us to recall, and help us to take it in a well-pleasing manner. In Christ's name. As we are refreshed every Lord's Day, as we keep in mind the death of Christ and thank you for that, we're mindful of Ephesians 1:3, that all spiritual blessings are in Christ. And then all the many blessings we have in this world. And so the Lord has blessed us, and so I know many of you have already done this, but we want to pray, thank God for the things he's given us, and the baskets are in the back that you did not contribute as you came in. But let's pray. Father in heaven, we thank you again for this day. We thank you for every blessing we have. We have so many things, and we are truly rich because of the things you do for us. And Father, thank you for our abilities, for our talents that we're willing to use, that we can make a living while we serve and take care of our families and others. And so as we give back this day, we realize we're giving back what already belongs to you. But help us to just be mindful that as we get back to the work of the church, for the spread of the gospel, may we always do the very best, help us examine our hearts and get back this day. Thank you for loving us. In Christ we pray. Amen.
This is my Father's word, and to my listening ears, all nature sings and round me rings the music of the spheres. This is my Father's word. I rest me in the thought of rocks and trees, of skies and seas, and the wonders wrought. This is my Father's word. The birds and heralds raise, the morning light, the lily white, declare their Maker's praise. This is my Father's word. that goes wrong seems all so strong. God is the ruler yet. This is my Father's word. Why should my heart be sad? The Lord is King, let heaven ring. God reigns, let earth be glad.
Scripture this morning will be from John 14, 1 through 15. John 14, 1 through 15. Do not let your heart be troubled. Believe in God. Believe also in me. In my Father's house are many dwelling places. If it were not so, I would have told you. For I go to prepare a place for you. If I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also. And you know the way where I'm going. Thomas said to him, Lord, we do not know where you are going. How do we know the way? Jesus said to him, I am the way, and the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. If you had known me, you would have known my Father also. From now on you know him, and have seen him. Philip said to him, Lord, show us the Father, and it is enough for us. Jesus said to him, have I been so long with you, and yet you have not come to know me, Philip? He who has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, show us the Father? Do you not believe that I am in the Father, and the Father is in me? The words that I say to you, I do not speak on my own initiative, but the Father abiding in me does his works. Believe me that I am in the Father, and the Father is in me. Otherwise, believe because of the works themselves. Truly, truly, I say to you, he who believes in me, the works that I do, he will do also. And greater works than these he will do, because I go to the Father. Whatever you ask in my name, that will I do, so that the Father may be glorified in the Son. If you ask me anything in my name, I will do it. If you love me, you will keep my commandments.
Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this Lord's Day you bless us with. We thank you for the opportunity that we have to assemble together here and worship your holy name. We're especially thankful, dear Heavenly Father, for the technology that you've allowed us to develop that will allow others to worship with us, even though they can't be here in this room with us. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you most of all for Jesus, the sacrifice that he gave on the cross for our sins. We pray that as fathers, that as we live our daily lives, that we will strive to live like you, and that we will strive to lead our families just like you lead us as Christians. Dear Heavenly Father, at this time we pray that you will be with Brother Ben and thousands of other preachers this morning who prepared to deliver a message, the only message that can change our eternal destination if we'll hear, believe, and obey. Go with us through the rest of the service. Pray that everything is said and done be in accordance with our will. And pray that in the end, when this life is over, that you'll give us a home in heaven. In Jesus' name, amen.
Let's all stand please as we sing the song before we listen. If for the prize we have striven, after our labors are o'er, rest to our souls will be given on the eternal shore. Home of the soul, seated never to roam, free from all care, happy and bright. Jesus is there, He is the light, off in the storm. Lonely are we, sighing for home, longing for Thee. Beautiful home of the ransom beside the crystal sea. Soon the bright homeland adorning, we shall behold the glad dawn. Lean on the Lord till the morning, trust till the night is gone. Home of the soul, beautiful home, there we shall rest, never to roam, free from all care, happy and bright. Jesus is there, He is the light out in the storm. Lonely are we, sighing for home, longing for Thee. Beautiful home of the ransom beside the crystal sea.
Please be seated. As for me and my house, can you finish it? We will serve the Lord. One of the most iconic statements made in the scriptures. There's a lot of those that we immediately recognize. I hope that most of us would immediately recognize who said it. Anybody want to take a guess at who said that? Joshua. Very good. Joshua is the one who made that statement. But long before he makes that statement's made at the very end of the book named after him, Joshua chapter 24. But long before he makes that statement, he makes a decision. He makes a decision that he's going to do something and that he's going to trust in God. You go back to Numbers chapter 13 and chapter 14. You might remember that the spies are sent to view the land of Canaan. They're sent out to see what they think about it. And these spies, one from each of the tribes, goes out and begins to look over this land. And they find wonderful things. They find amazing cities and amazing crops and all sorts of things that this is the best place it could ever be. It's the place that God had promised to them that they would have and that they would take. God has already told them, this is the land I'm giving to you, but He sends these spies out there to look at it so that they, from a physical standpoint, can know what they're coming against. And when they come back, 10 of them say, it's good. It's got some good stuff in it. Look at all this stuff we brought back, but there are giants in the land. There are strong cities in the land. There are strong people in the land, and we cannot take this place. All of the spies except for Joshua and Caleb. Joshua and Caleb had a different story when they came back. They talked about all the things that were there, and they talked about all the people that were there, but their conclusion was, we serve God, and God will give us this place. After Caleb had already answered the people, they sort of began to rebel and start saying some things again about how they don't want to take it. But in Numbers chapter 14, beginning in verse 7, you see this. The land which we passed through to spy out is an exceedingly good land. Joshua and Caleb are telling Moses and the people, if the Lord is pleased with us, then He will bring us into the land and give it to us, a land which flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not fear the people of the land, for they will be our prey. Their protection has been removed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them. It's interesting in the list in Numbers chapter 13, when it's telling all of the people who are going to go out into this new land. it gives us a list of them, and it says from the tribe of Ephraim, Hoshea, the son of Nun. Now, we know the son of Nun to be Joshua. And if you look just a few verses later in verse 16 of Numbers chapter 13, it says, "Now these are the names of the men whom Moses sent to spy out the land. But Moses called Hoshea, the son of Nun, Joshua." There's a little distinction. It's not big, but it's a little bit of a distinction between the names. Hoshea, or however you want to pronounce it, as we might say it, Hosea, because it's the same, I understand, as the name a little bit later in the Old Testament, means salvation. But Joshua means Yahweh is salvation. It's a slight distinction, but it's one that apparently Moses, either he gave him after this event, and he just tells us about it in chapter 13, or he had already seen this within Joshua. The decision that Joshua had made, that we see echoed in, "As for me and my house," the decision is, Yahweh, God, is my salvation. I'm not salvation on my own. I don't have deliverance on my own. I can't do it by myself. It is God who brings salvation. Joshua knew that God could take care of it. And that's the reason Joshua and Caleb are the only two who were able to go from that generation into the land of Canaan. They're the only ones who trusted that God could take care of them. Later, as Moses, and when Moses dies, Joshua chapter 1 tells us a little bit more about a conversation that God had with Joshua. And on some level, we might think, well, Joshua was fearful of what he was about to do. Maybe he was apprehensive about taking over leadership of someone so great as Moses. But if you remember in the beginning of Joshua chapter 1, it really doesn't tell us that Joshua is worried, but 3 times it tells us, Joshua, be strong and be very courageous. It's repeated for him to hear and for us to hear. I think we might get more out of it, or as much out of it as Joshua does. As we read those lines, we think, okay, if God is with us, we can be strong and we can be very courageous. Think about the things that he's going to do from this point on. He's going to go into the land of Canaan. The very first thing that's going to happen is the Jordan River is going to part as the Ark of the Covenant goes through. Jericho's walls are going to fall, and there's going to be various conquests throughout the land, all because Joshua understood that God is salvation. So let's go back to that very first statement that's made in Joshua chapter 24. Here's the full statement, beginning in verse 14. "Now therefore, fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in truth. And put away the gods which your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. And if it is disagreeable in your sight to serve the Lord, then choose you this day whom you will serve. Whether it's the gods which your fathers served, which were beyond the river, or the gods of the Ammonites in whose land you are now living. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." I want you to notice that phrase for just a moment. I struggled with this, Mike, for just a little bit because I was thinking, grammatically speaking, the sentence seems to not be correct. But I think that you can actually formulate the sentence this way. I'm not the English student that Mike and Karen and Jane and others who may be in here are. But regardless of the grammatical mistakes, if there are any, but I think it works out okay. I think it's worded correctly, isn't it? Not from the grammatical sense, but it's worded correctly Joshua understood was it started with him. It started with his decision as a father, his decision as a parent, his decision as a husband, his decision as a leader. It starts with me. Now, Joshua could very well have said, as for me and this country, as for me and this church, as for me and this people, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Now, what Joshua understood was he had control over him, and he had influence over his family. He might not have had influences greatly over other things, but as far as his family unit was concerned, he had the influence to change them. He had the influence to help them and to guide them and to strengthen them in all the ways that he needed to. And so as we approach this day and we think about this day, this Father's Day, we think about the great responsibility and the great commitment it takes to raise our family in the Lord. We're told in several places to do so. Mothers, you have a responsibility as well. We talk about you, and sometimes dads go, well, why don't we talk bad about dads on Father's Day and talk good about mothers on Mother's Day? Why don't we step on the toes of the dads, but we don't step on the toes of the mother? Well, what I try to do is that I try to do both. Not that I want to step on toes, but as we begin to teach principles that apply to fathers or principles that apply to mothers, guess what? Some of you are going to be doing those things and working hard in those areas, and you're going to be making a difference in those areas. And so you're not getting your toes stepped on. Some of us struggle in some of those areas, and I say us because sometimes that's me too. And so the message, whether coming from me or coming from someone else, may step on my toes and on your toes. But I want us to see what was it that Joshua said that in this passage, this little short passage that we read, about what fathers need to do in their homes. If he says, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord, he gives some keys to doing that earlier on. He says to them, first of all, now fear the Lord. The idea of fearing God is something we see all throughout the Scriptures. In fact, if you get to the end of Ecclesiastes, he tells us that the whole of man is to fear God and keep his commandments. The idea of fear is not necessarily being afraid, although it carries some of that with it. It's about reverence to him. It's about honor to him. It's about respect to him. You think about the children of Israel, and sometimes they were good at that. Sometimes the children of Israel feared the Lord, respected the Lord, honored the Lord. Sometimes they didn't. There were certainly things about him that would strike fear into the Israelites, into the Egyptians, the plague, the parting of the Red Sea, the ability of God to rescue them in so many different ways. And in fact, as Israel was coming into Canaan, a lot of the nations were afraid of them, not because of Israel, but because they knew that they had God on their side. They might not have known who the God was, but they knew that the gods were on their side, whatever that meant. And they were fearful of his capabilities. And you say, well, it was just in the Old Testament that people feared God. Well, if you look at some of the stories about Jesus, there was a healthy reverence and fear for even him as he was on the earth. I'm reminded mostly of Matthew chapter 4 and chapter 5. In Matthew chapter 4, you see Jesus going out with his disciples onto the sea, and if you remember, there's a great storm that rises up. And they were afraid, and they wake up Jesus, and Jesus gets up and he rebukes the wind, and it says that they were greatly afraid of him and said, who is this that even the wind and the sea obey? If you were out on the ocean tomorrow, or you were out on the Tennessee River tomorrow, and a great storm rose, and you were fearful of getting to the shore, and somebody in your boat all of a sudden said, peace, be still, and the storm stopped, would you be afraid of him? I would be. The guy who can say stop it to a storm, and it does it, has a lot of power within him. next chapter, as they get to the shoreline, they come to this man who's possessed by demons. And after speaking to him, he sends the demons into a herd of swine. You remember this? And the herd of swine run into the ocean, or into the sea. And when they do, it says that the people who were watching the swine fled. You know what fleeing usually entails? I'm scared. And they go to town, and not only are they scared, but they bring all these people back with them. And when they get back there, they plead with Jesus to leave us. We don't want you here. This is scary to us. Go away. Jesus himself carried the ability and the power to strike fear, but also it brought about reverence. To those who were willing to submit to him, they didn't follow him for 3 years because they were scared of him. They followed him because they knew that he had the power. You go back to the reading that Blake did for us a little bit earlier. Have I not been with you so long, Philip, that you don't see that I'm in the Father and the Father is in me? That I've got the same powers, I've got the same abilities that the Father has. When you're looking at me walking on the earth, you're seeing a representation of the Father. So fear him, and then Joshua says this, and serve him. And he says 2 parts to that. Serve him in sincerity, not because you feel you have to, but serve him out of the genuine place in your heart. See, they dealt with this, they struggled with this in Israel about really serving God sincerely. They would claim that they served him. They would sort of put on an act that they served him, but it wasn't always from the heart. I want you to serve him from a genuine place in your heart. And I want you to serve him in truth. John chapter 4, Jesus reminds us in discussion with the woman at the well. He says, those who worship the Father will do so in what? Spirit and truth. We're going to pay attention to what the Scripture says about how we worship. That's been important in the Old Testament and the New Testament. He gives us examples of how they worship. He gives us examples not only of how, but of what their heart was like when they did. Sometimes in the Old Testament they got it right, sometimes they didn't. Sometimes in the New Testament they got it right, and sometimes they didn't. It's about sincerity, but it's also about doing things the way God wants us to do them. It's about worshiping in the ways that God wants us to worship. And so following the pattern of the Scripture, what we see there, we don't see instruments in the New Testament, so we don't use instruments in our worship. It's as simple as that. That's why we do it. That's why we don't do that. In the Old Testament, you saw them. In the New Testament, you don't, so we try to follow the pattern of what we see within the New Testament. We serve him in sincerity, and we serve him in truth. And then notice the third thing he said. I want you to fear the Lord, I want you to serve him, and I want you to put away the gods. Put away the other gods. Put away the other things that stand in your way. First, put away the gods of the people around you, because he comes back to that actually. He says, if it's not agreeable in your sight to serve the Lord, he says, I want you to fear him, I want you to serve him, and I want you to put away the gods. But if it's disagreeable in your sight to do that, then choose today which ones you are going to serve. Are you going to serve the gods of the Amorites, where you're at currently? Or are you going to serve the gods of the past, on the other side of the river Jordan, is what he's referring to. But as for me and my house, we'll serve the Lord. See, we have to make a decision today. As dads, as mothers, as just people of God in general, what are we going to hand down to our children? Are we going to teach them to fear God? Are we going to teach them to serve him in the ways that we are supposed to serve him? And by the way, how do we do that? We do that by showing them. It starts with us. As for me and my house will serve the Lord. And put away the gods. Are we giving the example of putting away the things that are holding us back from God? Putting away the things whether it's the things around us right now, or sometimes for us it's the way we did things in the past or the life that we lived in the past that's hard for us to let go of. Are we ready to put away the other gods? You can't serve two gods, remember? You can't serve two things, Matthew chapter 6 and verse 24. And friendship with the world is enmity or separation from God, James chapter 4 and verse 4. That's a pretty solid principle that Joshua gave us for teaching our children and for living our lives. But I want you to look at one last verse with me this morning. 1 Thessalonians chapter 2 and beginning in verse 10. 1 Thessalonians chapter 2 beginning in verse 10. If you read the bulletin this morning, you saw a reference to this. But I said we're going to look at it in a little bit more detail. And so very quickly, I want us to do that this morning. In 1 Thessalonians 2, verses 10 through 12, really if you start back in verse 9, Paul is describing his ministry. He's describing his work among those in Thessalonica. For you recall, brethren, our labor and hardship, how working night and day, so as not to be a burden to any of you, we proclaim to you the gospel of God. You are witnesses, and so is God, how devoutly and uprightly and blamelessly we behaved before you believers. Just as you know how we were exhorting and encouraging and imploring each one of you as a father would his own children, so that you would walk in a manner worthy of God who calls you into his own kingdom and glory. Here's the thing. Paul, we don't know a whole lot about Paul's life as far as children or whatever else. But we know that he raised a lot of people in the Lord. We know that he encouraged a lot of young men in their preaching, and he encouraged a lot of churches in their growth. And he compares it to how a father would deal with their children. And so what does he say about that? Well, first, at the end of it, he says, so that you would walk in a manner worthy of the God who calls you into his kingdom and glory. I want you to walk like a person of the kingdom. I want you to walk like a person who belongs to the king of the kingdom. How do you do that? Well, he said, we walked among you, first of all, devoutly. We were conscientiously, conscientious of the way that we walked and the life that we lived. We had a regard for the divine law and for pleasing God. That's what devoutly means. We walked uprightly, not just a mental aspect of deep regard, but correct conduct, the right kind of conduct. You can't help or encourage people to walk like God if you're not willing to do so. Paul says we walked devoutly in the way that we saw God, we walked uprightly in the way that we acted, and he even says blamelessly, without fault or blame. People may make accusations about him, but they wouldn't stick because Paul was doing what was right. I wish all dads, I wish all parents, I wish myself I could say that I've walked completely blamelessly in my life, but I can't say that. I've made my mistakes. But Paul just simply is saying, look, we attempted to do everything the way that we were supposed to do it as we were dealing with you. I hope that as fathers, as mothers, as members of God's kingdom, that we do that as well. But he goes a little bit further and he says this to them. Just as you know how we were exhorting, encouraging, and imploring. The first two of those, there's not a big distinction in them. Both of them carry the idea of to call alongside of. Both encouraging and exhorting have a part of that word that has alongside of with it. With exhorting, it's sort of calling alongside of in a way to motivate and to help. I was thinking about when you take your kids, if you've ever taken your kids skating when they were little, and you're right there with them. You're holding on to their hand. You've called them beside you to show them and to guide them. I think the poem that Tim read was a good example of that. Walk a little slower, Dad. Let me be right there with you. Let me watch your steps. Let me understand what that's like to be with you. And encouragement carries that same thing with it, except a little bit more of a comforting consolation. When someone's hurting, when your child is hurt, you pull them to your side, you pull them in, and you encourage them. He says, this is what we did with you, just like a father does. That's the example. Paul, when he's thinking about how can I express to the church what I've done for them, he thinks about a dad. Isn't that awesome? Then he thinks about how fathers walk along beside their children and guide them. He thinks about how they encourage them. He thinks about how they implore them, beg them earnestly to do the right things. He uses that example maybe because he'd seen it. And whether you're a father now, you're a father to be, maybe you're a grandfather, or maybe you're someone who years down the road you plan on that being something in your life. Learn from that example. Pull them beside you. Walk with them. Encourage them. And even to the point of begging them to do the right things. That's the example that Paul says, this is what we did. Why? So that you would walk in the way that God wants you to walk. Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 4 says, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger. You know this, right? But bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. One Old Testament leader, one New Testament leader. Hundreds of years separating them, but the same message. Be great parents. For today, be great fathers. Lead your children in a path where they can follow the Lord. What does that look like? Respect Him, serve Him, and put away distractions. Teach them to serve Him. Motivate them, comfort them, reason with them. There will be no greater Father's Day gift for the Father in heaven than for His children to come home. For His children to make a commitment to do better. For His children to come to Him for the very first time and give their lives to Him. One of those things may be something that you need to do today. Maybe you need to come believing in Him and repenting of your sins and confessing Him as Lord and Savior, being buried in baptism, to be raised up to walk in newness of life. Maybe you need to make some things right that you've left amiss in your life. Or maybe you just need to dedicate yourself, rededicate yourself to the right things. You might can do that where you're at, or you may need the prayers and encouragement of the church. You may need to come for the very first time and give your life to Him. In any of those scenarios, we invite you to respond to the gospel of Christ this morning as we stand and as we sing.
What can wash away my sin? Nothing but the blood of Jesus. What can make me whole again? Nothing but the blood of Jesus. Oh, precious is the flow that makes me white as snow. No other fount I know, nothing but the blood of Jesus. For my pardon this I see, nothing but the blood of Jesus. For my cleansing this my plea, nothing but the blood of Jesus. Oh, precious is the flow that makes me white